Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today in this brief overview of basically a lot of what we've been seeing over the past few years in the market as we walk with companies and larger enterprises that are building out and structuring their API programs and API strategies, and how we've been seeing them going about that and some of the pitfalls or tips that we've seen. In terms of agenda, I'll start by covering the proliferation of API and some of the big trends that we've seen around where APIs are fitting in terms of their place in the company strategy and how they've been growing there over the past few years. And then talking about the certain stages that APIs go through. We'll then walk through the biggest challenges that we've been seeing when it comes to APIs. And lastly, the 5 components that we've been seeing that companies are putting in place to really build a compelling API strategy and API program. In terms of background, I'm Iddo, CEO and founder of RapidAPI. And if you aren't familiar with RapidAPI, we're the world's largest API marketplace, used by over 1 million developers around the world to discover and connect to over 10,000 APIs. And we've been seeing billions of API requests flowing through the RapidAPI platform every month. We've been around since 2015, based out of San Francisco, so not too far from here, and running engineering out of Tel Aviv. So just to kind of recap a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, or to kind of put some structure around it, the biggest thing that we're seeing right now, and I mean, I don't think this is a huge surprise to anybody who came to this conference, but APIs are proliferating. It's a big trend, and it's something that we've seen as pretty top of mind for a lot of larger companies that we work with. They have huge potential. They have huge potential and huge promise, both as business creators and as accelerators of software development, but also a lot of challenges that they come with. And you need a strategy to basically manage how those APIs are created and consumed within the company. And it has to be one that encompasses the full lifecycle of the APIs. So going from private APIs and partner-facing APIs all the way to the public APIs that you're exposing to developers out there and the third-party APIs that your company is consuming. To start with the proliferation of APIs, and again, I'm sure that if you have spent your Thursday coming down here, you're big believers in the API economy. But just to recap that, IBM actually made a pretty famous prediction that the API economy will be a $2.2 trillion economy within the next 10 years. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but we've already seen multiple billion-dollar companies created around providing and supporting the API economy. And these are just some companies providing APIs to developers. There are also a lot of companies providing the API tooling that have proliferated pretty widely. And one of the biggest examples of that potentially is MuleSoft being acquired last year by Salesforce for north of $6 billion. So a lot of value and a lot of traction around the API economy. And when we think of APIs, every person kind of has a slightly different picture of what APIs are and where they fit into the architecture. So just to organize what that looks like, it really starts with the internal APIs. So every company has those. Those are APIs, services, microservices. They have a lot of different names that are built within the organization to power a lot of the software and the services that it's providing. But then you also have partners that the company is working with. And oftentimes what we see happening is some of these APIs end up getting exposed to the partners to allow them to integrate and enhance the applications that the company is providing. Then you also have the developer community. And a lot of companies are also going about it and providing APIs for those developers to be able to innovate and create new services on top of the company's technologies. So you have certain APIs going that way. And of course, and this is a part that a lot of people often don't think about necessarily, but you also have a lot of public and third-party APIs that your company is consuming to develop an application. So when you think about the components or the parts of the API strategy that companies are managing, there are 4 components to it. And it would be great if the animations worked. You have the private APIs that you're building to power your internal applications. So these are internal services that your company is creating that are sitting behind its web application, mobile application, and all of the services that it's providing. Some of these you then also expose to partners, and you make them public APIs. And really the point to kind of realize here is this is also a continuum. It's a continuous process where APIs are created internally, they get exposed, and then finally being made public. And most companies end up seeing APIs going through the flow. So it's not really three distinct buckets, but rather one linear process. And you have the third-party APIs that are being consumed. So these are the big components or stones that go into the API strategy. Now, just to break out what those different components look like. For the private APIs, we've really seen them entering the mainstream over the past few years. And the data here is from a survey from 2015, so I suspect the numbers are even higher. But even back then, over 68% of organizations reported using microservices or at least investigating using them in production. So we're seeing a huge uptake in microservices, service-oriented architecture, and of course that drives a lot of API creation. That adoption also creates a lot more APIs within those organizations. In fact, a more recent study from last year suggests that over 50% of organizations have more than 300 APIs that they're running, and almost all of them have over 100. So we're seeing a lot of APIs being created within the organization. But as those APIs gets created, there isn't necessarily a good way or a good process in place for developers and teams to share those APIs, right? So we see, and this is a story or an image that we've seen with a lot of companies that we work with, the different teams produce or create APIs, but they don't have a centralized strategy and process to share them. And that yields to a lot of code and process duplication. And this is a real, very streamlined picture from a real bank that we've talked with. So one of the biggest banks here in the US, where we've discovered that almost every team had its own version of their loan offering API because they didn't know other teams have already produced them. So there's not only code duplication and effort duplication between those teams, but you also got is in a non-negligible percent of the cases, those APIs actually priced loans differently. So if you go on the app and you ask for a loan and then you go on the website and you try to see what that loan would cost, you'd get different numbers. So actually hurting the developer experience as well. And what makes this API discovery even more difficult is the fact that those APIs aren't just running on one place. So it used to be pretty simple. You have your data center, all of your workloads are running there. So discovery can still be somewhat streamlined. But now what we're seeing is many companies have their data centers, they're running private clouds, public clouds, and even with Windows, you have some workloads running on Kubernetes or on serverless. You have some running on separate environments or managed PaaS environments. So those APIs are all over the place. So to kind of sum that up, we're seeing a huge uptake in the creation of private APIs, but a big challenge around discovering and consuming them. Moving on to partner-facing APIs, we've seen over the past few years that partner-facing APIs are becoming a huge and very significant revenue sources for companies. And again, this is a 2015 Harvard Business Review survey. There are a lot more companies now where a significant chunk of their revenue is being driven by the APIs that they're exposing. And with those companies, their main product is no longer a customer-facing experience, but rather the infrastructure that they're providing that then other companies build customer experiences on top of. So this is API partnership, and obviously they're in big part fueling a huge uptake in the number of APIs that are available to developers. So close to 30,000 public APIs available to developers right now, and these are both partner-facing and fully public self-service APIs. And obviously, beyond just showing that more companies are creating APIs, we're also seeing a huge uptake in companies leveraging external third-party APIs. And that's not surprising given the benefits of using those APIs. So by leveraging those third-party APIs and components, you get much faster development. You can integrate and use existing pieces rather than rebuilding and reconstructing those pieces from scratch. So things like text messaging, emailing, payment processing, machine learning can all now be consumed. You also tend to get better service as a lot of these companies specialize in those little atomic functions that they offer. And it tends to be a lot more cost effective as you don't need to hold and maintain the big teams around maintaining those services. And this is something that we find very exciting. It unlocks a lot of new possibilities. So doing things like integrating more data sets or providing more machine learning and AI functionality behind the services, because you can now consume them from third-party services and companies that provide them. But integrating those services is hard. And the biggest driver behind that is the fact that each one of those APIs speaks a different language in a sense. So it has a different format if it's REST or SOAP-based or a weird mixture or a weird variation of the two. It has a different authentication strategy, a different networking protocol. Some of them have more exotic features like client SSL, request signing, and a lot of things that at the end of the day make it difficult for developers to integrate with those APIs. And that's why we're seeing that by far the vast majority of API integrations take more than 30% and actually a lot more than 30% for developers to accomplish. So a lot of friction created around creating that plumbing of integrating the APIs. But beyond just the ineffectiveness and time spent on creating those integrations, we're seeing a lot of risk and challenges being brought in by those third-party APIs. And they all center around the fact that each one of those APIs becomes a runtime dependency of your application. So if you're using a third-party API and that API goes down, that means your application now goes down. If you're using a third-party API and it has a security breach, it's your data, or even worse, your customer's data that's getting leaked. If you're using an API and it's slow or has performance issues, it's your application that is slow. And lastly, if you care about things like GDPR compliance, HIPAA compliance, PCI compliance, the burden is on you to ensure that all of those APIs you're consuming are compliant with those standards as well. And all of those challenges become even more complex when a lot of these APIs are not necessarily bought in through a centralized IT procurement department, but are rather brought in ad hoc through developers that integrate them as part of the development workflow. So it's pretty hard to track them. And this is not just something that we've seen in the marketplace. It's actually a huge problem is that as those APIs proliferate more and more companies, we've seen researchers and analysts notice across more and more companies, those APIs create meaningful risk. And when you see those APIs, you know, there's a famous S3 incident when S3, the Amazon file storage API, went down, and we saw a lot of companies impacted by then, many of which didn't even know that they are reliant on that API. So this is something that needs to be managed. So if we kind of sum up where those APIs are fitting into the architecture and the challenges there, from an internal development perspective, you have internal APIs, so the private APIs and microservices, and the question there is how do you make them more accessible and more discoverable across the company? You have the external APIs that you're using, and there it's more of a question of governance and compliance around those APIs being used. You have the external partner-facing APIs where you want to make sure that you can expose APIs safely and make it as frictionless as possible for partners to integrate into your ecosystem. And lastly, you have the public APIs that you're exposing, where the question is how do you make it easier for developers in the broader community to create new services and innovate on top of your existing infrastructure. And obviously those free components are part of a workflow, right? So as we said, a lot of services start as private internal microservices, graduate or get exposed to certain partners, and then get exposed as public services. So it is a continuum process. And the common challenges here are sharing APIs, discovering APIs, and governing how those APIs are being shared and consumed. So when we come up with a strategy, the biggest goal around these strategies should be, you know, how do we create a place to collaborate and share around APIs? How do we enable the business to grow more seamlessly through API partnerships and providing APIs to our partners? How do we unlock innovation by exposing public APIs? And lastly, how do we govern and monitor the APIs that we're using externally? And when we go and look across a lot of companies that we work with and the strategy that they put in place, we realize that there are 5 key components that that strategy must encompass. It must start with executive support, so making sure that you have the executive backing to put meaningful time and budget behind creating and investing in your APIs. It must have the right organization structure, and I'm going to dive into what that means in a second here. It must have the right platform for those APIs to actually run on, the peripheral tooling surrounding those APIs, and of course, education and awareness to make sure that everybody across the organization is well aware and is educated on creating the right APIs and using APIs in a secure way. So the first topic that I'm going to touch on is executive support. And you know, one of the pitfalls or the things that we've seen a lot of companies believe in is, you know, API is a developer thing. It has to be grassroots adopted by developers, and that's very right. We've seen a huge transformation in the way that companies are buying software and buying technology, and developers are very big influencers in that journey. But when you want to create a cohesive API strategy and want to make sure that APIs are a big part of every part of the organization and every development that takes place, it needs to have that executive support behind it. And those two go hand in hand. You need to have developers bought into the idea of APIs, but you also need to executive support and backing and budgeting behind that. And that goes into 5 key components where executive support is necessary. You need the team, so that executive support is necessary to put together the right team that will be able to power that API lifecycle. You need to invest and buy centralized tooling for the company to be the platform behind those APIs. You need to invest time. I mean, it takes time to put APIs and make them proper. you need the incentive, so incentivize different teams to invest in their APIs and expose them, and to create the culture that breaks silos and promotes API across the organization. And in fact, when you look at some of the biggest companies today, we've seen that they have a lot of executive support around APIs. Small software company out of Seattle, Microsoft, currently, I believe, the most valuable company in the world. And we've seen back in June, Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, actually publicly proclaimed on a Wired interview that APIs are a huge part of their strategy. And this was just before the Microsoft Build conference, where they just released a lot of newer APIs. And he here very clearly said how much Microsoft is investing on a top-down level in creating an API strategy. Another famous example, also Seattle-based company called Amazon, where Jeff Bezos, back in 2002, famously sent out a letter to all of the Amazon employees and said, first of all of the teams must expose their data and functionality as basically APIs, so service interfaces. That's what we call APIs today. He then went on to describe what those APIs look like. In the last bullet, so the sixth bullet in this letter, actually clearly said, anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Now, I'm not suggesting firing anybody over not exposing APIs. I'm not sure I'm in a position to do that. But this just shows how much a company like Amazon invests and values their API strategy. And I don't know if that was the only part, but I'm sure it had something and was a contributing factor in the growth of the Amazon company over the past few years. And you can see how much their stock has grown since then. Another example that I'll just highlight, and I'm not going to play the video here, but I highly suggest watching it, especially if you're in the financial space. This is Steven from JP Morgan, who recently did an interview about how they're viewing APIs and how much they're valuing APIs as part of their strategy. So definitely, it's on YouTube. You can search for it, and I definitely recommend watching it. So this is executive support, and as I said, one of the most critical components in building an API strategy. The second component that we're going to look at is the organizational structure. And the biggest point of tension that we've seen around the organizational structure is around balancing vertical ownership. So who should own APIs and who should make the decision about them? The teams that are creating those APIs and providing them, or a centralized horizontal team that runs API across the organization? And the questions that really need to be addressed there are who approves which APIs we're using and who approves the APIs that we're publishing, so the governance questions. Questions around the standards and the protocols that we're using for APIs, so who approves the standards and the shape and look and feel of those APIs? And then who decides and actually budgets out those tooling? Are we buying one set of tools across the company, or do we leave it for each team to buy their own tools? And there is tension, and there is a reason why this is a contentious issue in many companies. On the one hand, when you have the vertical teams owning this, they can optimize and buy the right tool and choose the right technologies that fit their specific use case, because a lot of these standards aren't one size fit all. You could have an organization where using Kafka or an event-driven approach makes sense in one part, but GraphQL makes sense in another part, and maybe RESTful is the right answer for everybody else. It also allows for more experimentation, and it creates a culture of ownership. You create teams that actually own and value their APIs. But then when you implement horizontal standards, you get a lot more interoperability, where different teams can more easily consume APIs from other teams, and less of that siloing that we traditionally see in larger companies. And the model that we've seen to work best is a hybrid ownership model, where you have certain pieces of the puzzle and certain decisions being made by the individual teams, but then the decisions around the centralized platforming and the central place where APIs are discovered and consumed, that's being decided by a central committee or team or horizontal organization throughout the company. So if you break down the lifecycle of the APIs and the toolings that are attached to it, everything that surrounds how those APIs are being built, that is bought by the different teams that are producing those APIs. But at the same time, you still need a centralized team that decides what APIs are we publishing, what APIs can we consume, and where do we manage and place all of these APIs. And a lot of times the way that is done is by creating a centralized platform for those APIs. So that's the next and third components that I'm going to touch on, which is where those APIs are being managed. So again, when you have a lot of vertical ownership, what you end up with is a lot of APIs that are running throughout the company, running in different platforms. So it can be in a data center, it can be in the cloud, it can be on Kubernetes, on serverless. They're all using different gateways and runtime components to power those APIs. But for the developers in the companies or external to the company that now want to discover those APIs and access them, this can become a pretty daunting task. And in fact, again, and these are two charts that I've shown earlier, but what makes that task even more difficult is the fact that a lot of these APIs, well, first of all, there are a lot of these APIs, but they're also deployed in a lot of different platforms. And the way we've seen companies going about solving this is by establishing an API hub. So creating a single place, and there are a lot of technologies that can power that, that developers can, from the left-hand side, go to publish and put APIs and control who can access them. And again, you have one hub, then you have the individual teams publishing it, so it has to be a self-service model. From the right-hand side, you have the internal API consumers and the external partners and developers consuming the APIs going to that hub to discover and provision their API access. You have the governance team running the hub and administering it to define what external APIs can go into it and what standards API should meet before they can be published into the hub. And you, of course, can bring all the public APIs that you're using. So now we sort out this mess by providing developers with a single place they can go to discover and connect to those APIs. And that is the value of the hub. And the key functionality to look at when you're looking and procuring those hubs is, first of all, API publishing. You want to support as many standards as possible because, again, the APIs are built by the vertical teams. They decide on the tooling. They decide on the platforms that they use. And you want to create a single place that will support all the different gateways, runtime environments, and standards that they are using. You want to have it, and this is the most critical component, power real high-quality discovery of APIs on that hub, and then also allow developers to test and evaluate those APIs. You want to help the provisioning take place there and make it self-service so developers can get up and running with APIs that they have discovered on the hub quickly. You want to power the analytics, so look at analytic and metrics and how developers can evaluate how their APIs that they're publishing into the hubs are being used, and power discussions and support to allow developers to collaborate on the hub more easily. So this is the API hub, and one of the most critical tooling decisions that need to be made when looking at the API strategy. But then beyond that, there's a lot of peripheral tooling that goes into building an API strategy. And I'm not going to go into all the tooling. We have a whole conference here full of people from all different parts of the lifecycle. But I am going to touch on a few components that we see as critical. The first component is API design. So providing tooling for developers to design APIs and create the specs that they can then put into the hub. And this is actually when we have seen a lot of companies adopting the API hub. One of the biggest struggles for them is actually just getting the API specs and API documentation. And this is kind of like one of those junk in, junk out situations. If you don't have good API specs and good API documentation, you can have the fanciest hub in the world, but it's going to be empty. So API design, there's a lot of great tooling out there to help developers design their APIs and create documentation around them. The second one is testing and monitoring. You want to ensure that all of those APIs are tested, they're monitored, you know when an API goes down, and you know how those APIs are performing across all of the region and geos that you work in. And you're able to define pretty complex tests here. And again, a lot of really cool companies, I think API Fortress is out here today as well, creating interesting tooling around API testing and monitoring. And then another category that we've seen as pretty interesting recently is synthetic data. So when you want to make those APIs self-service on the hub, it's critical to ensure that you can allow anybody to very quickly get started with those APIs. But in many cases, those APIs have data behind them that requires a lot of governance or has a lot of regulation around who can actually view and get exposed to it. And synthetic data is a big trend that we've been seeing around helping companies create synthetic data sets, so fake data or non-real data and non-sensitive data that still mimics all the statistical behavior and the structure of the original data, so allowing developers to create models and AI algorithms around it while not actually risking the actual data and the actual customer information being entrusted with your APIs. And then one more component is around API middleware. So being able to take older services, older data sets, and modernize them into a single API hub. And into a single, more modern API that developers can now consume. And we've seen a lot of companies providing tooling around that as well. So this is a lot of the peripheral tooling, and there are a lot more tooling categories that are critical when you create your API strategy. These are just a few that I've been touching on today. And then the last component, once you put together an API strategy and the API hub and you have all the tooling around it, is education and awareness. Making sure everybody in the company is aware of all the different tools that are available to them and all the different steps and processes to release APIs, and are educated to use the tooling and to create APIs that adhere to the standards that you determine. And I'm going to touch on this very briefly, but in terms of awareness, some of the things that we've found to work very well are creating API newsletter, highlighting those tools and highlighting new APIs that get created. And this is also a big incentive for developers within the company to create APIs when they know that it's something that can be surfaced to the rest of the organization and give them a lot of influence in the org. Celebrating wins. Every time an API drives business, drives revenue, or gets used in more creative ways, celebrate those wins to create that positive incentive for developers to create more APIs. And there are a lot of events that can be created, if those are internal hackathons or internal meetups, to get people to adopt those APIs more heavily. So that's awareness. And then on the education side, the three key areas around that are API standards, so making sure everybody is aware of best practices and standards in the API economy, creating seminars around those internally, and there are a lot of great online courses that can be exposed internally, so developers can very easily, in their own pace, learn more about those API standards. So combining that all together, these are the 5 key components that we see as necessary when creating the API strategy: executive support, the organizational structure, API platforming, peripheral tooling, and education and awareness. And we think that with those 5 components in mind, every company can put the right API strategy that fits its own need. I hope this has been informative for everybody here today. I'm going to be here for the rest of the day, so if you want to ask any more questions or have any further thoughts, I'd love to hear them. If not, you can also ping me via email. And you'll also see more of us here wearing the gray shirt, so feel free to talk to any one of us to get connected with the RapidAPI team. So thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference.